Carrie, thank you so much. Also, let me extend congratulations for a well-deserved recognition of your work. The Lincoln Prize, it's the top prize, I think, in our field, and so it's really fantastic. Also, I just want to piggyback on what Rob said as well about this institution, its importance, and understanding our Civil War. Always can be a little self-indulgent when you're giving a talk. I cut my teeth as a historian here in Richmond when I was a graduate student, working on my dissertation, and I was at the Richmond National Battlefield Park. This museum obviously was not here. Even, in fact, the Park Service's Tredegar Visitor Center. And so the result of that is that many of the people who came to the park, they were able to see the battlefield. Of course, they got excellent tours. But what they lacked is the context. They had a hard time situating the stories on that battlefield and the broader social understanding of the war. And this museum, it kind of does it all. And so it's so encouraging, one, to see all of you here. I think it's a fantastic thing. This is the beginning of it. But it's also great to know that this place is here and that people can come to Richmond. They can hear a wide range of important stories. Then they can go out into the battlefield. I truly believe that when you're on that field, you can get deeper meaning from the actions of those men. They're all interested in where they fought. That's important. I'm not diminishing it. We also need to understand why it mattered. This place certainly helps us. After 4 days and 4 nights of hunting down Union soldiers in the swamps near Confederate Jesse Hill, out in the open, didn't have a tent, didn't have a blanket, just a gun. Didn't find any Union soldiers. It was about 60 of his comrades. But they did encounter a number of civilians, farms, isolated farms, I suspect. And Hill was absolutely disgusted by what he saw. Comrades, they pillaged those farms with impunity. Later wrote to his wife. Those of you who are controlling the screen up here, you know what? How do I advance? Told me, how do I advance PowerPoint? I have no clicker. Should I tell you to advance it? Oh, here we come. I'm so sorry about this. I'm so sorry about that. I didn't even ask for it. So just tell me what I need to do.
Just press the button.
Just that button?
Yeah.
All right, sounds great. Thank you so much. There we go. Our men just robbed the poor women and children. It was a sight. They went to the houses and taken anything they wanted. I hope the army will never have to come through where you live, for they would steal everything you have. The soldiers is the roguiest people that lives. We killed hogs, chickens, and anything we wanted. So back in camp, Hill's situation didn't improve. He sent off another letter to his wife. Some say, and it's important to note here, that his wife, Emmeline, she was illiterate. Some say that you and Lily said that you did not want me nor felt to run away. That is all right, but I don't care what you or her wants. If I take the notion, I'm a comin'. I have not drawed 1 cent and but mighty little of anything, and I ain't gonna stay at no such a damn place, because I can make more at home in the bushes making brooms than I can here in this, he's saying, infernal war. Obviously, Hill wants out. And you can hear his frustrations. You can hear his frustrations and how he lashed out at his wife, telling her that she was not in a place to instruct him on what he should do. Now, all of us have read in this room countless Civil War letters. We've heard the men, like Hill, grumble about being in the ranks. But Hill's different. You all noted it, I'm sure. He spoke his letters. Spoke them. He did not write them. Now, I'm not sure if Hill was illiterate or semi-literate, but clearly he was not comfortable with the pen. Now, we see that Hill is like many other Civil War soldiers, and linguists describe them as transitionally literate. Transitionally literate. They knew their letter sounds, but didn't know proper spelling, didn't know syntax or grammar, etc. So we can take Hill's understandable contempt for the silent E. Right? So when he writes some, S-O-M-E, he puts on paper S-O-M. Wife, not W-I-F-E, but W-I-F. He was, like many others, a phonetic writer. And I'll be honest, until spell check, I was a phonetic writer as well. Thank God for it. Ben, you can hear this guy speak, right? I mean, look how he says infernal war. You can hear it. It's right there. Now, Confederates like Hill, they spoke their letters because they didn't have their noses in books growing up. Man, they're used to jawing with their friends, face to face. And so when the war came, they suddenly had to communicate with pen and paper. As you can imagine, it was extremely unnatural for them. And that's what my talk is going to be about today. It's going to be about these Confederate soldiers, semi-literate, transitionally literate. Those are the folks that we're going to focus on. Now, we're going to do that because I feel like that to some degree, they've been overlooked by historians, and there's some very good reasons for that. First of all, these semi-literate Confederates, they almost always came from modest means. Some are just absolutely dirt poor. And so you can imagine during the war, their families back on the home front, and they're focused on getting through the day-to-day. And after the war, you can only imagine that many of these families, of these veterans, man, they're having a tough time just surviving. You can think about the economic malaise is a kind word here, but the economic malaise that settled on the South during Reconstruction. And if you're a sharecropper or a tenant farmer, are you really going to have as a top priority to preserve the letters of a family member who fought in the Confederate Army? I just imagine again the physical conditions in which you'd have to preserve those letters. If you don't have a chest, you don't have a way to keep them safely, we all know what the humidity and the bugs and the critters can do to documents. So this source, right, was a fragile source and one that I suspect among many poorer Confederate families was not preserved. There is a privilege here as well. This is my second point, and that privilege is the privilege of the archives. Walk a little bit here. Until really about, I'd say, the 1970s, maybe the 80s, the archives and what was deemed historical, what was considered to be significant, almost entirely came from the privileged classes, almost entirely from white folks, and of course, almost always from men. That's changed and that's shifted. The archives, they're very aware that we need to collect the voices of a wide range of people. But for a very long period of time, the letters of these semi-literate, they are on the margins. They're on the margins just not in their real lives, but they're on the margins within the archives itself. So there is not the amount of source material that you would typically find from your so-called common Confederate soldier. And I'm just going to throw this other point in, because if I don't say it now, I'll forget. How many of you are excited to go out and buy a book of transcribed correspondence from a semi-literate Confederate soldier? Probably not, right? So the very published volumes that we have all read, they come from the soldier's pen. They come, of course, from those men who were formally educated, right? That's where we usually turn our historical attention. The other point is that the semi-literate Confederates, they weren't particularly ideological. Didn't really deal with ideas, didn't deal with high politics. And as Carrie just mentioned before, when we think about one of the overriding or significant questions that has defined the field of Civil War history, that question is, why did soldiers fight? What's their motivation? And we have hit it from a wide range of angles. I'm pleased that today you're going to get a number of important talks that ask different and important questions. But the fact remains is that the question about why men fought is an important one, a significant one, and a central one to the study of the rank and file. You all know, of course, Joseph Glatar. He is actually the first person who I think raised that question in a book called, I'm going to slow down here. When I talk to my students, I always expect them to get pen and paper out to write it down, and they look at me like, man, what world are you living in? We've got cell phones. We can type it in. So you can type this in your cell phone if you like. It's an outstanding book. It is, I think, held up extraordinarily well. It's called To the Sea and Beyond. To the Sea and Beyond. Joseph Glatar. It looks at Sherman's men as they made that final campaign through the Carolinas. It is a social history of that army, and it also raises the question as to why men fought. The person who has received a great deal of attention in this area is James McPherson. I don't need to run through his historiography. His books, of course, are extraordinarily important, and For Cause and Comrade is one that, if you've not read, it's certainly worth your time. I just want to stress this is an important historiography. It is one that I do not dismiss, but I think, again, that emphasis on why men have fought has led us to focus almost exclusively on the well-educated, and then we conclude what? Well, there's your common soldier. And so I'm here to say that there is no common soldier in the Civil War. That's what I wanted to be the first line of my book. My book is called is about what they fought for as soldiers, but my first line, what I wanted was, there's no common soldier. The editors nixed that. They said, your book's about the common soldier. You can't then write your first line, there's no common soldier. And so I agreed, reluctantly, I agreed. There is no common soldier. And I think we're going to find today is that there is such a wide range of experiences. And again, my hope is that you're going to get a glimpse of a class of soldiers that we've not talked about very often. The final thing about these letters, these semi-literate soldiers, they focus on the daily grind. About food, about hunger, about sickness, about their clothing. Not just about what's happening in the army, but they're also concerned and raise these questions about what's going on back home with their families. They're particularly interested on, how the crops doing, right? How's everybody's health? They want some local gossip as well. You look at those letters and you're like, man, this stuff, and I've heard it time and time, even from my students, it seems boring. It's too mundane. It's the day-to-day life. What can you draw from that? I'm telling you what you can draw from it. What you can draw from it is you get the essence of their existence. You get the day-to-day struggles. You get men trying to find a sense of dignity and self-worth in a world that is alien and that is overwhelming them, and yet they're trying to retain what? Some sense of normalcy, and above all else, an emotional connection to those folks back home. I find in these letters, I find a language. To me, it's a powerful and a poignant language. It's a language of men, again, for the first time in their lives, having to put pen to paper, and they're separated for the first time in their lives from the people that they love the most, care about the most. It's impossible for us to appreciate them grappling with this, right? The effort that they had to exert to be able to find the words somehow, some way, to try to convey not just what was happening to them, but also the love that they had for those wives and those children. I don't want any of my students to hear my next point, because it's a central one to this talk, but I'm afraid they're going to take this point and then apply it to their own writing. one of my arguments here is the very fact that these semi-literate soldiers had no formalized training as writers. Right? The grammar meant nothing. Structure means nothing. There's no syntax. They're all over the place. But my point is, it freed them as writers. And I could just hear one of my students just say that, man. Professor Carmichael, I didn't use any punctuation. I didn't care about paragraphs. I don't care about logic. I want to be free as a writer. I'm ready for that argument to be made to me. But I'm telling you, with these men, and this is one of the great ironies, with these men, without those restrictions, they're not harnessed in at all, man. They just take that to the side, and they speak, and they tell the war as they see it, and they feel it in that moment. There is an immediacy that you get from these letters that you can't get from privileged soldiers. You just can't feel it. You can't find it. I'll even say they come closer than anybody else in this Civil War to telling a true war story. Closer than anybody else. Here we go. These are 4 key themes we're going to talk about today. 4 key themes that I think run throughout the letters of the semi-literate Confederates. Themes that will tell us about, more importantly, and I want to say this with greater emphasis, for the most part, these men are poor. Right? They're on the social and economic margins of their society. We're going to get a glimpse into how they experienced the war, but also how they depicted it. So here are my 4 reasons. This is pretty didactic, isn't it, man? You feel like you're right back in class at 9 o'clock in the morning. But Rob and I were talking, and we're going to do something different this year. I hope it's a tradition. You know, usually you get at a conference, and what do the attendees get to do at the end? You get to write your evaluation, right? No, not here. We are actually going to quiz you all. And if you pass the quiz, we'll let you come back to next year's conference. So here we go. Right? Here's the first 4 themes. Pay close attention. You'll be quizzed at the end of this. First is this. These men spoke with remarkably open, let me pull that back. They spoke with remarkable openness. They were incredibly free in expressing their emotions. I want to also be clear that that's not unique to them. I was struck in writing my book that even men of the privileged classes, they ultimately turned to their wives, to their sweethearts, to their family members, and they were often not inhibited to tell the people back home how they were feeling. But with these poor men, the floodgates were open. Second point, their stream of conscious writing style, I've already told you before, I think that brings a degree of realism to the war that we often don't see in other letters. The third point, they saw the war as a bare-bones struggle. I've already referenced that as well. The very thing that might seem to be tedious or boring or mundane, the day-to-day grind, man, I'm telling you, that gets to the essence of their experience. And I'll just make a very quick point. I hope all of you read Bell Wiley. Look, I'm a big believer in paying homage to historiography. Knowing that historiography. Bell Wiley, who wrote Life of Johnny Reb, Life of Billy Yank, and my advisor, Gary Gallagher, would be disappointed in me now because I can't tell you the publication year off the top of my head. He's like, I'll just say it, he's like the Rain Man. You can pull off a book, he'll tell you the publisher, where it was published, and the year. It's truly phenomenal. I know it was published in Indianapolis, Life of Johnny Reb. I think it's in the late 1950s. I hope I'm not wrong about that. It's social history before social history became fashionable. What Wiley did so well is he talked about the material or physical realities of soldiering. If you have not read the book, I'll say it again. Bell Wiley, Life of Johnny Reb, did that first. Second book, The Life of Billy Yank. And also, just a quick point. I'm struck by how this class of Civil War soldiers or Confederate soldiers, how they believed that the Army was using them, that they were a thing to be discarded. That point comes up time and time again. And now the final point. Well, you see this time of trouble and sorrow. I pretty much have covered that. The final point. You got to think of these men as writers. And if you don't want to think of them as writers, well, I'll just say this. If you think Jack Kerouac is a writer and he has literary flair, then you got to see these semi-literate Confederates as writers as well. I'm being serious about that. And one of the things, that if you understand them as writers, you have to look at silences. I've been thinking about this for a while. Often when we look at a letter and we say, we know this happened at a historical event, but this historical actor, when he or she wrote about it, it's not there. They don't mention it. So how do you explain that? Well, my point is that silences, they're intentional. Not always, but often. And what we're going to find in these letters is a powerful critique of the Confederate ruling class. It is a powerful critique that you can hear through silence. The Confederate ruling class wanted its soldiers to see the war as almost a holy war, that the Confederate nation was blessed by providence, that every death on the battlefield was a sacred death for the Confederate nation. And I'm telling you, time and time again, those ideas, so crucial to the Confederate war effort, they were not parroted in the letters of the semi-literate. Okay. Before we get started here, I'm going to give you a few case studies, but I just want to make a quick point that's about literacy. Literacy rates in Civil War armies, about 80% in the Confederate Army, about 90% in the Union Army. Historian Steve Berry at the University of Georgia, he makes a salient point, and it is this. We should not see literacy as just a single thing. All right? Literacy runs along a continuum. And if you want to find the spectrum of literacy, you should turn to this. Private Voices. And there's Steve Berry in the lower right-hand corner. Private Voices. It's a remarkable collection. I'm just curious if you could raise your hands. How many of you have looked at this digital project online? Raise your hands high. It's phenomenal. So this is what it is. It's a collection of more than 10,000 soldier letters from the transitionally literate, right? Union and Confederate, but mostly Confederate. And here's the best news of all. All the letters are transcribed. They're all typed up there for you. They have a brilliant search engine, so you can, if you want to go by battle, by unit, by name, you can do it. It's a phenomenal site. Again, more than 10,000 letters. Within that site, there's also two other things I want to point out. There's a section called Camp Talk. Camp Talk. Camp Talk offers a specialized glossary of soldier vernacular. So if you're a reenactor, and I look out into this audience, and I don't suspect that we have many in our midst, but if you're at home watching and you're a Civil War reenactor, you should go to Camp Talk. Or let's just say you want to be indecipherable to your friends. Go to Camp Talk. You can find some interesting stuff. I'm going to read you a few things right now. Bowl pudding. Anyone know what bowl pudding? Anyone know what that is? Bowl pudding. Here we go. I'll tell you. It is smashed stuffed beef and pork soaked in fried apple and sugar. I'm quite certain it is the fried apple that makes the dish there. All right, that is bowl pudding. The next is owls have caught him. Owls have caught him. Any ideas? Owls have caught him. That's when a picket deserts in the middle of the night. Owls have got him. Horn colic. Horn colic. Horn colic, ready? Is a pain caused by suppressed or frustrated sexual arousal. And then finally, kill around the corner. Kill around the corner is cheap whiskey. So you can go again to this site. You can go to Camp Talk, and there's a long list of things, part of the soldier vernacular. There's one other section as well. It is a linguistic map. It's fascinating. They've been able to determine patterns of speech and where it's located regionally. Dixie, for example, they didn't find any of it below the Mason-Dixon line based on all references above. So I implore you all to go and see Private Voices. It's fantastic. One of the things about soldier letters, when I came to this project, well, I'll just be direct. So my book, challenge, because as I said before, how am I doing? Am I still mic'd up okay? Okay, so what do you want me to do? You want me to come to this now? You want me to turn this off? So I'm done with them. I'm done with this. Yes? Yeah, I can't hear. What do they say? Yes, okay. All right. All right. Tethered to a podium is not my natural state, as you can tell, but I'll be just fine here. So when I started this book, man, the historiography is fully matured, especially around the question, why did they fight? It was really difficult to try to find a new angle. And the angle that I assumed was one, asking the question, not just what they thought, but how they thought. And to ask how they thought, so how do you do that? How do you get underneath the words, right, the letters that are on this correspondence? Well, I did it by this, and it begins with, don't accept Civil War letters as transparent windows into the past. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that there's not a truth, but what I'm suggesting to you is to do this. With every soldier, you need to imagine that person taking in his world. And in perceiving that world, it's being filtered through a wide range of lenses. I'll just list a few. It could be manliness, it can be honor, it could be godliness, a host of things. And it is that perceptual orientation that takes into those events is then digested of sorts, and then that soldier becomes a writer and actually becomes our first historian. Our first historians are soldiers. When they put pen to paper, that's what they're doing. And they're making choices as writers, and that's crucial. And they're thinking about audience, who's reading it, who's going to receive it. And it will, of course, I think, open up your understanding of the past, not just the Civil War, if we think about historical sources with a more critical eye about how they're actually composed and how they're made. So, let's think about the privileged classes, right? The privileged classes, I believe, they were wired to translate the horrors of war into heroism. It's the world that they came from. You cannot possibly imagine that North Carolina soldier, Hill, you think he read, the Peloponnesian history of war? Of course not, right? Did he sit around in a parlor and hear war stories and on the walls of that parlor see this? This is a popular lithograph of the Mexican War, of course, and as you can see by the image, the artists, they were not slaves to realism. These mountains in Mexico look like, they're in the Swiss Alps, right? But that lack of realism, it filters down to their depiction of war itself. Look at the neat lines, right? There's very little blood. There's no sense of terror or horror, and we can only see the casualties, which I believe are Mexicans entirely. Another print here I'll show you. This is a critical one because it elevates war as not as a collective struggle, but elevates war that there is one person, one soldier, through heroism and through bravery can make the decisive difference. And so again, I want you to put all that together. I want you to think about the letters that you typically have read and those men and the world they came from before the war, the stories they heard, right? The training they received in their schools and the visual culture that was around them as well. It elevated war, and it should come as no surprise to us, no surprise, that these men saw grandeur in war. I mean, y'all been to, I hope, to Gettysburg and been to Pickett's Charge, and you just got to be sort of shocked, not by just what happened, but how the survivors wrote about it. They weren't aghast. I mean, yeah, they had a bad day, no doubt about it, and they were slightly demoralized, but when you look at their letters and how they depicted what had occurred, it is very much in keeping with an understanding of war that it is through sheer individual bravery and heroism that it will win the day.
Obviously, semi-literate Confederate soldiers did not come from that tradition, and instead, they're war letters. They're war letters. They've got that raw writing style, jumbled organization, tortured syntax. It brings the chaos of battle right to the reader. I'm giving you an example of that from a Georgian soldier, William Hewell, of the 10th Georgia. It's a very fragmented account of Gettysburg. It's very tough reading. So be patient with me. You would think after 20 plus years of reading undergraduate papers that I'd be better at reading semi-literate letters, but I'm not. You know, that was absolutely a cheap shot at my students. I love my students. They all deserve A's. They're all wonderful, right? All right. I got hit there above my right eye slightly. I bled right smart, and I went on of the battle. Late that evening, but I went back the next morning and lay under the shells, them heaving them. We had to run, but about 400 yards in sight of their artillery. Their shells came very thick, bursting around us. Yes, us. I heard them coming, and I would fall down and let them pass over. There went some 2 or 3 feet above my head and hit the ground some 5 or 6 feet from me. I didn't know what minute I would be struck. It was right scary times. And you can feel the sensory horrors of that artillery barrage, right? Ewell's zigzagging from point to point. It mirrors the jarring movements that occurred in his own mind. Man, this is a man, you can feel it, the trauma of war. Now, as I said, educated soldiers, they got that formalized way of writing, and that helped them transform the chaos and confusion of battle into a narrative and something that was very coherent. I just want to make a quick point here. I'll probably say it again. Look, I'm not suggesting to you all that writing style determines content exclusively. I believe it has an important role and one that we often neglect. So I want to make that again clear. Trauma, did men who were well educated and privileged, did they feel it? Did they contend with it? Absolutely. Even if they wrote stylized letters back home, yeah, they still felt it. So we're going to now look at a comparison to Hewell. This is William R.J. Pegram, right here from Richmond, from Linden Row, by the way. That's where he grew up. He's in his early 20s. In 1864, he had attended the University of Virginia for less than a year. The point is, well, in fact, his mother oversaw a boarding house, as well as a school for ladies. So he came from educated circles. He's connected to the slaveholding class, and he has left us with one of the most graphic letters of the fighting at the Crater. We all know that's July 30th of 1864. I won't give you the particulars. You can look it up. I'm sure you all know about it. Pegram was an observer there, stood not so far from Robert E. Lee. Just want to make a quick point. We don't know if Lee actually saw what Pegram, you're going to hear, saw at the Crater. We don't know if Lee saw it, but I can assure you this. He absolutely knew that USCT soldiers, black soldiers, that they had been what? Murdered. Gunned down in cold blood. Dear Jenny is his sister, his youngest sister. I think that's important as well. Dear Jenny, the affair on Saturday was exceedingly brilliant for us. I never saw such a sight as I saw on that portion of the line. For a good distance in the trenches, the Yankees, white and black, principally the latter, were piled 2 or 3 or 4 feet deep. A few of our men were wounded by the Negroes, which exasperated them very much. They were hardly less than 600 dead, and then that's dash, I'm so sorry, that's my typo there. 400 of whom were Negroes. As soon as we got up on them, they threw down their arms to surrender, but were not allowed to do so. Every bomb-proof I saw had 1 or 2 dead Negroes in it who had skulked out of the fight and had been found and killed by our men. This was perfectly right as a matter of policy. You could see them lying dead all along the route to the rear. It seems cruel to murder them in cold blood. I'll get it. I'm so sorry. There you go. Seems cruel to murder them in cold blood, but I think the men who did it had very good cause for doing so. I have always said that I wish the enemy would bring some Negroes against the army. I am convinced since Saturday's fight that it has a splendid effect on our men. On the whole, Saturday was, through the merciful kindness of an all and ever merciful God, a very brilliant day for us. Listen, I'm going to say it. His writing style did not lead him to approve or sanction the murder of those black soldiers. It is William Pegram's commitment to the institution of slavery. It is his belief that the Confederate cause was a cause under God. And above all else, it was his certainty that black men wearing the blue suit and carrying a musket could not be soldiers. They had to be what? They had to be, in essence, slaves in insurrection who were pushed to do that by the black Republicans, right? The Union Army. What's the irony about this letter is that what did Pegram actually reveal, even though he was doing all he could to elevate the manliness of white Confederates, right? But what he revealed is that black men could be what? They could be men too. They could fight too. Man, these men are going to their graves knowing what? If they got captured, they weren't going to be allowed to surrender. It's one of the most powerful and important letters that I've ever read on the war here in Virginia. It is a letter that is quoted, and I'm just going to tell you all, quoted selectively at the crater. There's a little audio station there. I won't say much more about it, but it is a disappointment because I want to be clear. The National Park Service as a whole has done a brilliant job in engaging issues of race and slavery. Brilliant job. They're aware of it, and they're doing their best. That audio station is a tragedy. It's a tragedy to take this man's letter and to minimize that what occurred there was a war crime. And I don't want to hear, oh, these black soldiers are saying, remember Fort Pillow. They're yelling Fort Pillow because they know the stakes of the game. But what's striking about this letter to me, and in fact, it came to me with a teacher's conference, this teacher said to me, he said, Pete, it's a story, man. It is a story. It's a morality play. That's how this has been reconceived. I mean, think about this letter I just read to you. Is there any blood? No. Got any feel of terror in this? Absolutely not. Compare that to Huell's letter at Gettysburg, man. He's scared and he says it. He talks about the blood. You can feel it. But this is what? It's sanitized, it's polished, and yet, there's something that is what? Absolutely frightening. And I'll just have you all, I hope we'll get some time to talk. I've been always struck that third line. It seems cruel to murder them in cold blood. I'm telling you, this letter with my students, we'll spend almost an entire class period on it. And that line, man, I'm just going to put it out there. Talk about it later. Did he feel guilt over what had occurred? Did Pegram feel guilt? There's something that Huell, the Georgia soldier, and Pegram, they actually shared together. Even though these men came from very different social worlds, what they shared together is that they couldn't be anonymous in the army. No man could. Everybody knew that everybody was watching. Remember Hill's letter? He's like, I heard what his wife had said. There's a transmission of ideas that not just through letters, but orally as well. You misbehave, you're cowardly, you get drunk, you go see a prostitute. Man, that stuff's going to make it back home. Everybody knew it. And that's what I'm saying about these letters. Man, Pegram wrote that letter because he knew his baby sister here in Richmond was going to read it. That's shocking to me, man. The Richmond papers, they barely cover the massacre that occurred at the crater. There's one in Richmond that, of course, did what? It applauded it. And so I've always thought, man, was Pegram trying to get her straight? I don't know. But I do know this. Every Civil War soldier knew that everybody was watching and watching at all times. What I'm struck by is how, though poor or semi-literate Confederate soldiers, they talked about their suffering differently. Privileged men, they often would write about their suffering to make a point that they were suffering nobly. that they were making sacrifices for the cause. But for these semi-literate men, they wrote about their bodies in extremely graphic ways. And one thing that they wrote about all the time is diarrhea. I mean, I'm not making a joke here, all the time. James Robertson, I know everybody in here has probably read some of Dr. Robertson's work. He was a great influence to me when I was a kid back in Indiana. I love the Stonewall Brigade. It was a fantastic book. We should pay homage to Dr. Robertson. He's an important player in the field. Dr. Robertson said to me, and to an entire audience, over the years, he collected different spellings of diarrhea from Civil War soldiers. He said, I think he was up to 13 or 14 before he passed. Yeah. Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a poor soldier named Wright Vinson. Wright Vinson. Wright Vinson's from Georgia. Wright Vinson was a non-slaveholder. His wife was pregnant in 1861 when he enlisted. He was in a state like militia outfit. He was sent to the Georgia coast. That's an important point because he was able to sneak away from time to time and make those important visits back home. When the Conscription Act came in 1862, his outfit was then transferred into regular Confederate service. That would be the Army of Tennessee. And with that, Wright Vinson was moving all over the place. And now suddenly, that important communication, face-to-face that he could do, was no longer possible. And so he, Vinson, was yearning to connect and communicate with his wife and trying to find a way to say, what does our suffering, what does the separation mean? And I can assure you that he and her never, ever understood it as a great act or sacrifice for the Confederate Army. The first letter. Man, it says it all. Darling, if I could see you, I could tell you a great deal. I could talk with you about things that I have seen since I left home. Dear, I have a heap to write, but I can't write it. And I'm telling you, in his other letters, how graphic and open he was. He spoke about a woman either getting raped or she was a prostitute. He described a bunch of Union prisoners who got captured as they were bathing, described their naked bodies. He even admitted to, after a battle in Kentucky, he came across a corpse of a Union soldier, and I don't know what possessed him to do this, but he took his finger and poked in the dead man's eye. Right? Of course that happened during the war. It should not shock us, but the fact is that he actually spoke or wrote about it. He was desperate to get back home. Desperate. Oh, I did what I didn't want to do. Okay, hopefully this will come back. Darling, you spoke to me to pray and pray forth. Yeah. Classic, right? The wife who's the religious and spiritual counselor. Darling, it comes from my heart. You don't know how it makes me feel when I get down. You and the baby is on my mind all the time, and it hurts me to think that I can't be with you and the baby. Is this how Civil War soldiers, particularly Southern soldiers, how they were supposed to carry themselves? Are they supposed to admit weakness? Are they supposed to admit that they're lonesome? You see, man, this man is on the brink of what they call melancholy. Things get worse for him. Wait a minute. Darling, I hope when this comes to hand it, will find you the same good blessings of life. It is the worst eating that I've ever done in my life. Certainly it looks to me that I could eat up a whole sack at one time. It will kill all of us in our bowels if we don't get some soon. I think he's actually referring to salt there. I don't see now chance to get any. We ain't got any soap either. We ain't had a bit since Paul left. I ain't washed my clothes in a month, and I shan't till I get soap. Everything I have got is black as the black sow. I don't reckon you want to see me bad with my fine suit on. Darling, I'm ashamed to tell you that I am lousy. Obviously, he has lice. It is the body louse I have done my best to keep them off, but God in heaven knows they ain't now any chance to do it. So if I was to get the chance to come home, you would hate to touch me, right? Or you would get them on you, and I wouldn't have that for $50. Dear, so nothing more, your loving husband, goodbye, honey, right, Vincent. And then at the very bottom, kiss Charlie for me, telling me as a father, but a sorry one. Tragic, man. It's brutal. God's already admitted that he's having a difficult time being able to articulate what he's going through. But above everything else, this is called the abjugation of the self. It's holding himself responsible for an army that won't take proper care of him, won't even get him a good uniform, won't get him the soap, that he has been reduced. He is being dehumanized. And you can see that he is struggling to find the words to say just that. And that last line, a man, of course, who takes great pride and love in his family and being a father, but in that last line, he feels his unworthiness because his physical condition has what? It has deteriorated. The story does not end well for Wright Vincent. Wright Vincent almost deserted. Brother did his best to talk him into doing so. Beginning of 1863, Wright Vincent died the anti-heroic death in a hospital far away from home. He wasted away without comrades or a family member at his side. Cot was soiled. His body was covered with blisters. Skin was charred from internal bleeding. Wright Vincent has succumbed to the ravages of smallpox in less than a week. All he could do was look at a photograph of his wife. He said, and I'm quoting, that he looked at it and it felt like it ought to speak to him. That it ought to speak to him. He had no choice but to break off communication. He feared that if he touched the letter, the stationery, the envelope, that he passed smallpox to his family. So he had a hospital steward take his last words, a steward that was barely literate himself. That steward said this, explained that Vincent was afraid to write to him for fear that he might have the smallpox himself and send it to you in a letter. And the final brutal irony to this is that to protect his family from destruction of the war, Wright Vincent had to cut himself entirely off from the people he loved most in the world. Again, one might say, and this is another big question, at the time here, we're good, that I hope that we discuss. There is maybe a tendency among some people to see the death of Wright Vincent as another sad example of a non-slaveholder giving his life for a Confederate cause. A non-slaveholder who was duped in fighting a war that did not represent his interest. I just want to say this for us to think about and to consider. It troubles me that we sometimes expect people in the past to have a vocabulary and a way of seeing the world that was not within their reach. And I think that's critical here for Wright Vincent. Time and time again, historians, scholars, believe that there was not class animosity or tension in the ranks of Civil War armies because poor Civil War soldiers did not express their frustrations with the language of class. Here's an idea. I suspect that Wright Vincent never read Karl Marx. What do you think, right? So I think it's time for us to talk about again about why non-slaveholders fought and the reasons they did, and the question, were they duped? Were they misled? One way of trying to get to that, and I'm going to be very quick here because it is a word that is like ether coming out of my mouth, and that word is the word discourse. It's misused today, particularly among academics, who they use discourse as discussion. That's not what it is at all, and not even remotely close. What discourse is about language. It's about the power of language and how it shapes political alternatives. I cannot stress that to you enough. I'm going to give two quick analogies or comparisons to today, and I'm not being political, right? Here we go. When you talk about the war on terror, the language, war on terror. That's pretty hard to dissent against, is it not? You can't say, I have questions about the war on terror. That language is powerful. Good? Call for social justice. Who can raise a hand and say, wait a minute, I'm a little concerned about what we mean here when we talk about social justice? Those are quick examples again that I've not gone in any depth about. I just throw it out there so that you can understand the role of discourse in shaping, confining, or containing how Confederates responded to the war. And I'm going to turn to the Battle of Missionary Ridge, November 25th, 1863. This is what I do with my students so that they can understand discourse, all right? Here it is. 3 different possibilities I tell my class in terms of what they could say after that fiasco of Missionary Ridge. You all know it, right? The Confederates just ran like hell. And here's 3 different options. And then I ask my students, and we could talk about this in the discussion period. I'll say, all right, what was possible? What could you say? So here's example number 1. Bragg is a fool. There's the picture of Braxton Bragg. Bragg is a fool. His unibrow is off-putting. We need a general like Lee to lead us. That's number 1. Possible response. Number 2, we were cowards for running, and the Yankees are let's just say are, not out, our masters in battle. And then finally, number 3, our cause is cursed by slavery. God has abandoned us. All right, privately and publicly. Number 1, I suspect you could say that without any fear of retribution. No one's going to be suspicious of your loyalties or your sense of duty. Good? Number 2, that gets a little tough, does it not? Right? Some people might think that privately, but that might be a tough thing to say because we know what's valued above all else is courage and manliness. To admit any kind of weakness, especially to the enemy, that's a very, very tough call. Probably not said publicly. Maybe some people said it privately. And then the final point, right? Our cause is cursed by slavery. If anyone thought it, I certainly didn't say it. Certainly didn't say it. Again, my students, I don't want them to necessarily agree about what could be said and what couldn't be said. What I want them to appreciate is that there is a dominant language called discourse. And that discourse, that language is connected to power, it's connected to coercion, and it spells out what's possible, what can be said. Think about this. Pickett's charge. I always have to go back to Gettysburg. Adams County Chamber of Commerce. I'm obligated, right? I give my nod to Gettysburg here. It's post Gettysburg. You're back in Virginia. You're a Confederate soldier. Can you say, R.E. Lee is nothing but an SOB, he got us needlessly killed, and this war is a war for the slaveholder? Can you say that after Gettysburg? You could feel it, but you probably couldn't say it publicly. This is a critical point that I'm trying to convey to you all so that we can, I think, have a better understanding of what's possible in terms of political dissent. So because of time here, I'm not going to go. What I do usually is this. I give him a soldier. It's William Christian and his reaction to Missionary Ridge. I will briefly read this or quickly read it. I haven't nothing new to write more than the Yankees has whipped us and run us to Dalton. I saw it all myself. When they whip us off of Missionary Ridge, we had to run. When they take a notion to whip us, they just run over us and make us run. All be taken, or all be taken. And we prefer to run before we be taken. I hate to run from a man, but I'm afraid that we'll have to run again before peace is made. I'm going to be really brief and efficient because I want to get to a final point here so we can open it up to questions. Is this a political condemnation of Bragg and the Confederate Army? No, it's not. Is it political? It absolutely is. Absolutely. First point. Look, he admits to running. Ooh, that's pretty brave. Remember I told you before, these semi-literate soldiers, they're more expressive often than some of the privileged men. So we see that. And we know that what are Southern soldiers supposed to do? Always face the front. And not only does he admit to getting whipped and running, but what else does he say? I'm afraid we're going to have to keep doing this. Shocking to me. Now, let's go to the silences. And that's the crucial point here. The silences. Does he hold up the Confederate dead at Missionary Ridge as martyrs for the cause? No. Does he say, hey, man, we got to keep fighting? We have to redeem ourselves for what happened at Missionary Ridge? No. What I see is peace. That's what I see before peace is made. Does he say peace on Confederate terms? No. I'm telling you, Jeff Davis doesn't want his Johnny Rebs reacting to a defeat like this. Is this a radical statement of political dissent? No, not. But that's my point, man. That's discourse. And what is remarkable, and what I think should be impressed upon, you all know that these Confederate soldiers at this stage of the war, wherever they turn, whether it is a newspaper, whether it is a sermon, whether it is something from their own officers, it is a unified message, and that is what? You need to fight to the death. And what you will find in Private Voices, and I hope you all check it out, you will rarely find a semi-literate Confederate soldier who describe the Yankees as barbaric and who will say that they need to keep fighting to the bitter end. I'm going to skip over another quote for the sake of time. And read you the words of James Zimmerman. Because what you're going to see in James Zimmerman as well is you're going to see that he too rejects the ideas of Confederate discourse. You can see that he was unsure, he was confused, and ultimately that he in part takes responsibility for a war, but yet at the same time, it's not a full broadside against Confederate rulers. He doesn't do that. That's not really possible. And so I'll read it for you. I feel very much like starting home. Sometimes when I get about half enough to eat, and I'm telling you, man, that line, how powerful is that? I mean, for me, that's the real stuff. I mean, yeah, I like Battles and Leaders. I like reading Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. I mean, that stuff is powerful and it means something. But that line, I feel like starting home sometimes when I get about half enough to eat. And then I get to studying how the thing is going on here. And it makes me feel like somebody's to blame and not me. I am innocent of having anything to do to bring on this war. And I don't feel right suffering here as I do on account of somebody's misdoings. My friends, we have to bring confusion back to history. We want clarity. We want to be able to see the past in a sense that they never saw it that way. We have to remind ourselves in our everyday struggles, and I hope to God this holds true for everybody here, that if you think you have some great understanding of this world, then during lunch, please tell me it. Because every day I wake up and I am utterly incapable to try to make sense of what's truly incomprehensible. For these men, cut off, struggling to write. Communication is unreliable. Rumor is everywhere, man. They are enshrouded in rumor, and you can feel it. You can hear it right there. That's history. Not clarity. It's not purpose. That's history. They feel lost. They feel lost. But they don't feel so lost that they can't be political. And so when we say their letters are too raw, they're too mundane, they're too ordinary, man, that is an absolute mistake. Because these men, time and time again, they offered a condemnation of war. War is a tragedy. Killing is a sin. Man, duty will just get you killed senselessly. And that what soldiering? Not building character, that's for sure. The soldiering was leading to turning men into brutes. This full-blown critique of war's inhumanity. We see it here among these Confederates. And when do we see it again? Not to modernism that follows World War I. We don't see it until then. But these guys did it first. From William Wagner, from Catawba County, North Carolina. I want this war to end, and I hope and pray to God it will end before long, some way or another, so we all can go home to our dear wives and children and live in peace as before. For God only knows, I'm tired of the war, that I don't hardly know what to do anymore. I hardly don't know what to do. Those words Those words are of dissent. Those words of dissent, they are nurtured in his imagination. Jeff Davis and Ari Lee, I don't want the men in the rank and files dreaming of an alternative of being home, an alternative of no war, an alternative of being reunited with the family. These words, as I hope you've discovered today, they're poetic. They're literary. William Wagner, at the end of this letter, he wrote this to his wife. Dear, if I only could be at home to eat peaches. 2 months later, he wrote this letter, at the age of 32. William Wagner died of chronic diarrhea at Point Lookout Mountain in Maryland and buried in a mass grave. Thank you very much. All right, we have some time for questions here, and we have some people with microphones, and we kind of want to try to focus on the question aspect if we can. I, of course, always welcome observations, but let's try to do questions, and if you do have a point to be made, we've got to make it super efficient, and we can always, of course, continue this conversation during lunch. So, please.
These letters are just very touching, and but did you see a difference of letters written at the beginning of the war and from the end of the war? Did attitudes change? Was there, we're going to go out and whip those Yankees, or letters like this?
That's an outstanding question, and of course, we need to generalize in response to this. I would say that certainly at the beginning of the war, there's maybe a little bit more enthusiasm and welcoming the first battle and believing that they could bring this to a speedy conclusion. But what's constant throughout, from beginning to end, is that sense of separation, that struggle, that frustration to be able to communicate with loved ones. And I cannot stress this enough. These men, their lives were enshrouded by rumor and uncertainty. And of course, for the first time in their lives, they don't get to wake up at 5 in the morning to go feed the chickens or do whatever they need to do on the farm, and they set the pace and time of their day, right? Now they're in the ranks of an army in which there are others that have created that structure for them. So they have lost the mastery of their own lives on a day-to-day basis. That frustration is there from the very beginning and continues. But you are correct. By the end of the war, the word peace comes out much more. And again, you all can interpret it a different way. I see peace, and I say, you know what? They don't care about how this war ends. Let's just end this thing. What I don't see in their letters, this idea, Confederate nationalism, hey, it's an absolute important line of inquiry. I spent a little bit of time thinking about it. But that seems to make sense with these privileged men. These poor soldiers, man, they don't write about Ari Lee. I didn't see anything like, let's just believe in Lee, man. They're saying everybody's running at Petersburg. They talk about the desertion, they talk about men fleeing to the Yankees, and they talk about guys getting shot. There's their reality. I'll just make a quick point so we get another question. Good history, in my mind, it takes people who own the same or stand on the same historical space at the same historical moment, and they see and experience it in very different ways. That's good history. You go out that battlefield, what do we want to do? We want to tell bedtime stories. Was there heroism out there? Absolutely. Should it be told? Without a doubt. But there was also cowardice, and that sort of sets up my friend Leslie here. She's going to be speaking about that as well. Stories, side by side, of people on that ground, right? But they make meaning of it in very different ways. I think I see hands. It's so bright.
Yes, we've got a question from one of our online viewers.
Oh, sure.
Did you study the letters from Union soldiers? And if so, did you find them similar in the style and expressiveness as the Confederate letters?
I've not spent as much time with Union soldiers. I certainly have read them. I think what is the unifying theme is the impoverishment in the ranks. Man, I'm telling you all, I was shocked by what I found on both sides. These guys are scraping by, going months on end without pay. It's tough going. Now, for many poor Union soldiers, they certainly, I'm not saying that they did not endure moments of hardship. They absolutely did. But that physical reality, the grind, the struggle to get through the day, and then the ultimate belief that we have been abandoned by our own armies. I just want to make a quick point. People who want to universalize the soldier experience, there are certainly commonalities throughout time, some, but don't overdo it. Because the idea that somehow the Vietnam soldier or veteran was the first man who was abandoned by our government, which in itself is a questionable, I think, assertion. I'm telling you, these Civil War soldiers, they didn't have that support network at home. Local communities tried to do their best to help the wives and help the widows. They tried, without a doubt. But the men in the ranks, can you imagine a U.S. soldier today going 4 months and not getting back pay? Huh? Can you imagine that? Imagine the health care and the clothing that these men in Civil War armies did not get. I mean, it's not even remotely close. And again, that's not to say one group of soldiers suffered more than others. I'm not saying that. I'm just telling you, be careful when you want to say, well, soldiering's the same. I hear a talk every year at the National Cemetery, Gettysburg, and it, of course, drives me crazy. And the guy makes that point. Oh, soldiers always grumbled about food. They're always complaining they want to go home. Like, oh, my God. Like, yeah, but there's profound differences in their lived experience. So thank you for that question. Yeah. Oh, we have another question here. Yeah. Last question? Yeah, okay.
Peter, can you talk a little bit about the recipients? Many of the recipients were transitionally literate or illiterate. How and why did they keep these letters? And did you find a difference between letters preserved from soldiers who survived the war and soldiers who didn't?
Right. So I didn't really find a difference, to answer your last question, between those who survived and those who did not. For those women who kept those letters, the reasoning for that, I cannot say, except there's a John Futch, F-U-T-C-H, who's prominent in my book. He's illiterate. He deserted after Gettysburg, lost his brother. His brother died in his arms at Gettysburg. He deserted with 11 other men. He gets caught and gets executed near Montpelier. It's the largest execution in Lee's army. That set of letters, what's so remarkable is that there are a few from his wife, and it's fascinating. Man, she goes at him hard. You need to go to the medical board. You need to get yourself out of this. And so the voice of those poor women, you can even hear it. Man, you heard it in Hills, right? He gets that message from his wife, from another soldier somehow, I assume. You need to get out. And I'm telling y'all, go to the battlefield, and if you don't talk about the wives, you don't talk about the families, you don't make that connection, you're missing it. You're missing it. Because they certainly thought about it. And so we even do have the voice of some of these semi-literate soldiers. Last point, very quick, because I know we need to move on. Hill, first guy I opened with, he in another letter says something to his wife about, hey, you've got this person who's helping you write, and basically I don't understand what he's writing. Just again, can you imagine that, right? So desperate to find out how your loved ones are doing, and you just can't get the words. When we often say, all's left is words, man, they often didn't even have that. Such a pleasure. Looking forward to continuing the conversation at lunch, and we'll see you all later this afternoon. Thanks.